Eleanor was 72 years old when her world was methodically dismantled. It was not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow, deliberate erosion, like a coastline giving way to a relentless sea. For 48 years, she had been Mrs. Richard Sterling. That title had been her identity, her profession, her entire architecture of being. She had polished the name until it shone, managing the grand house that was its headquarters, and raising the two children who were its legacy. Her own name, Eleanor, felt like a thing she had packed away in an attic trunk long ago, a relic from a girl she barely remembered. Richard was a man who built things, empires of concrete and finance that scraped the sky. Eleanor had been the foundation, unseen and underground, but utterly essential. She hosted the dinners where deals were born. She remembered the names of wives and the allergies of children. She created a world of seamless comfort and quiet elegance that allowed Richard to move through his life unburdened by the friction of daily existence. He never had to wonder if his suit was clean or if there was food in the refrigerator. He never had to schedule a repairman or plan a holiday. Eleanor was the silent, efficient engine of his life, and for her service, she had believed she was cherished. She had been wrong. The dismantling began with a conversation on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky outside a placid, indifferent blue. Richard, at 74, announced he wanted a divorce. He used words like new chapter and personal fulfillment. He spoke of a desire to find himself before it was too late. Eleanor listened, her hands resting in her lap, the teacup on the table between them growing cold. What he was really saying, what lay beneath the polished, therapeutic jargon, was that he had found a new woman, a younger woman named Candace, who was a consultant he had hired. A woman who saw him not as the man who sometimes forgot his reading glasses, but as a titan of industry, a powerful, fascinating figure. A woman who was not yet tired of his stories. The legal proceedings were the next stage of the demolition. Richard, a man who had always avoided conflict within the walls of their home, proved to be a formidable opponent in the courtroom. Or rather, his lawyers were formidable. They were abetted by his children from his first marriage, Stephen and Claire. Eleanor had been their stepmother since they were teenagers. She had tried to be kind, to bridge the gap, but they had always seen her as the woman who had replaced their mother, the quiet appendage to their powerful father. Now, with the scent of inheritance in the air, their polite distance curdled into active hostility. They stood beside their father, a united front of sterling ambition. They whispered in his ear, fueling his resolve, framing Eleanor not as a partner of 5 decades, but as an employee whose contract was being terminated. The final hearing was her public humiliation. She sat on a hard wooden bench in a sterile room that smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. Richard's lawyer, a man with a merciless smile, painted a picture of her as a woman who had contributed nothing. A homemaker. The word was deployed like a pejorative, a synonym for freeloader. He listed Richard's achievements, the buildings, the companies, the vast portfolio. He detailed the life of luxury Eleanor had supposedly enjoyed, as if it were a salary she had been paid. Eleanor looked at Richard, hoping to see a flicker of protest, a shadow of the man who had once held her hand in a hospital waiting room, who had wept with her at her mother's funeral. She saw nothing. His face was a mask of detached resolution, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her. He was already living in his new chapter. She was a loose end to be tied up. Stephen and Claire sat behind him, their expressions a mixture of impatience and triumph. Claire, in a sharp, expensive suit, caught Eleanor's eye for a moment and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a gesture of pity so condescending it was worse than any insult. The judgment was swift and brutal. The family home, the one she had decorated and nurtured and filled with life, was technically hers. But it came with a second mortgage Richard had taken out to fund a new business venture, a debt so enormous she could never hope to service it on her own. Selling it was her only option. After the banks and the lawyers took their share, she would be left with a pittance. Her future, once a gentle slope into a comfortable old age, was now a cliff edge. And then came the final, peculiar insult. As a gesture of goodwill, Richard's lawyer announced Mr. Sterling was ceding to her a property he had owned for over 50 years, a property he had acquired long before his marriage to Eleanor. The lawyer presented it as an act of generosity. He did not mention what the property was. He did not have to. Stephen smirked. It was an old, disused commercial building in a town called Harmony Creek, a place so remote and forgotten it was little more than a name on an old map. It was considered utterly worthless, a tax liability Richard had been trying to unload for years. Giving it to her was not an act of kindness. It was a joke. It was a burden disguised as a gift. She was being given his garbage. As the papers were signed, a clerk handed her a small manila envelope containing the deed and a few other items from Richard's old office desk, things deemed too insignificant to move to his new life. Inside, nested in the stiff folds of the deed, was a single, small brass key. It was ornate and old-fashioned, with a decorative head shaped like a stylized bird. It looked like something from a fairy tale. It went to nothing she recognized. She held it in her palm, its metal cool against her skin. In the cold, sterile finality of the room, this small, solid object felt like the only real thing she had left. A cryptic clue to a life she had never known. A forgotten key to a future she could not yet imagine. The expulsion was worse than the hearing. The legal battle had been abstract, a war of words and paper. Packing up the house was a physical tearing away of her life. She had 1 week. Stephen and Claire appointed themselves as overseers, their presence a constant, suffocating pressure. They walked through the rooms with the cool appraisal of property developers, discussing what they would tear out, what they would change for the inevitable sale. "This wallpaper is hideous," Claire remarked, running a manicured finger down the silk paper in the dining room, the very paper Eleanor had spent a month choosing. "It will have to go." Eleanor was a ghost in her own home. She moved from room to room with cardboard boxes, the sound of packing tape a mournful screech that echoed the one in her own heart. Every object was a memory, a testament to a shared history that was now being denied. The ceramic vase she and Richard had bought in Italy on their 10th anniversary. Claire picked it up, inspected the bottom, and placed it in a box marked donation. The worn armchair where Eleanor had read stories to her own 2 children, now grown and living on another continent, blissfully unaware of the speed of their mother's ruin. Stephen had already arranged for a junk removal service to take it. "It smells of mothballs, Eleanor," he said, not unkindly, but with a finality that was absolute. They treated her not with overt cruelty, but with a chilling, businesslike efficiency. She was a problem to be managed, a logistical hurdle on the path to liquidating the asset. Her grief was an inconvenience. Her memories were clutter. On the final day, the house was an echoing cavern of its former self. Eleanor stood in the grand foyer, holding a single small suitcase containing a few changes of clothes, her toiletries, and the manila envelope with the deed and the brass key. Everything else she owned was in a small storage unit she could only afford for 3 months. Claire was tapping impatiently on her phone, arranging the meeting with the real estate agent. "Are you ready, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice tight with annoyance. "The car is waiting to take you to the apartment." Section. The apartment. Section. It was a 1-bedroom unit in a faceless complex on the grim outskirts of the city, the best she could afford with a small advance from the estate lawyer. It was a place to exist, not to live. As she stepped out of the front door for the last time, she did not look back. To look back would be to shatter completely. She felt Stephen's hand on her arm, a gesture not of comfort, but of propulsion. He was moving her along. "Dad sends his best," he murmured, a meaningless platitude. "He hopes you'll be comfortable." Eleanor said nothing. She got into the waiting car, the door closing with a soft, definitive thud. She was erased. She was eliminated. The dark night of the soul was not a single night, but a long, suffocating season. The apartment was beige and anonymous. It smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the faint, lingering scent of previous tenants' lonely meals. The windows looked out onto a parking lot and the brick wall of an identical building. For the first week, Eleanor did not unpack. She sat in the silence, which was louder than any noise she had ever known. In her old life, the house had always hummed with activity. The gardener, the cleaner, the phone ringing, the low thrum of the pool filter. Here, the silence was a dead weight. It pressed down on her, magnifying her insignificance. Her days lost their shape. There were no meals to plan, no schedules to coordinate, no one to care for. She had been the director of a complex and busy production, and overnight, the theater had been condemned. The cast had moved on. She was left alone on a dark stage. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach. She would wake in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, the numbers from her bank statement scrolling through her mind. The money was a rapidly shrinking island in an ocean of expenses. Soon the island would be gone, and she would drown. She saw her future with terrifying clarity, a series of progressively smaller, grimmer rooms, a life dependent on the cold charity of the state, a lonely death in a place where no one knew her name. She was 72, too old to start over, too young to die. She thought about her own children, so far away. She had called them, of course. They had been shocked, sympathetic. They offered to help, but their lives were complex, their own finances stretched with mortgages and college funds. She could not, would not, become a burden to them. Her pride, the last tattered remnant of her old life, would not allow it. One afternoon, desperate for something to do, she opened the manila envelope. She spread the documents on the small, wobbly card table that served as her dining area. The deed to the property in Harmony Creek. The paper was thick, the ink faded. And the key. She picked it up, turning it over and over in her fingers. It was a beautiful object, crafted with an artistry that no longer existed. The bird at its head seemed to be in mid-flight, its tiny wings outstretched. It was a key to a worthless building in a forgotten town. A key to nowhere. And yet, as she sat there in the sterile beige box, the key felt like a promise. It was a question that had not yet been answered. In a life that had become a series of crushing, definitive statements, the existence of a question was a glimmer of light. What was Harmony Creek? What was this building? What door did this key open? The thought, once planted, began to grow. What did she have to lose? Her life in the city was over. She was simply waiting for the end. To go to Harmony Creek would be an action, a movement. It would be a journey away from the humiliation, away from the pitying glances, away from the ghost of the life she had lost. It would be a step into the unknown. And for the first time in months, the unknown felt more appealing than the known. She made her decision. She used a chunk of her dwindling funds to pay off the storage unit and have her few possessions shipped to general delivery, Harmony Creek. She gave notice on the apartment. She bought a one-way bus ticket. The journey was a descent into a different America. The sleek, modern architecture of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to tired industrial towns, then to vast, open stretches of farmland. The bus was old, its engine a constant, groaning complaint. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the landscape roll by. It was a journey backward in time. The towns grew smaller, the buildings older. She was leaving the world of Richard Sterling, a world of glass towers and digital transactions, and entering a world of wood and rust and earth. After 2 days of travel, the bus driver called out, "Harmony Creek, next stop." Eleanor was the only one to get off. The bus stop was not a station, but a simple wooden bench under a faded sign on the side of a two-lane road. The bus pulled away, its diesel fumes dissipating into the clean, crisp air, leaving behind a profound silence. Eleanor stood with her small suitcase, a solitary figure in a vast, quiet landscape. The town of Harmony Creek was nestled in a shallow valley, a single main street with a handful of side roads branching off into residential lanes. The buildings on the main street were from the early 20th century, a mix of brick and clapboard. Some were well-maintained, with fresh paint and neat signage. A post office, a small grocery, a cafe with a cheerful red awning. Others were boarded up, their windows like vacant eyes. It was a town that was holding on, but just barely. She found the address from the deed easily. It was halfway down the main street, a two-story brick building that was larger than its neighbors. The ground floor windows were covered in thick plywood, plastered with faded, peeling posters from events that had happened decades ago. A thick mantle of ivy crawled up one side, softening the hard edges of its neglect. Above the boarded-up storefront, a weathered sign was still faintly legible. Harmony Creek Emporium. It was derelict. It was forgotten. And yet, as Eleanor stood before it, she felt not despair, but a strange sense of recognition. The brickwork was solid, the foundation firm. It was not crumbling. It was sleeping. There was a single door to the side of the main storefront, its paint peeling in long strips. The lock was a modern, industrial one, long since rusted shut. But this was clearly the main entrance to the old store. Eleanor walked the perimeter of the building. It was deeper than it looked, stretching back towards a rear alleyway. In the alley, overgrown with weeds, was another door. This one was different. It was tucked away beneath an old, rickety-looking external staircase that led to a sealed-off door on the second floor. The door on the ground level was made of heavy, dark wood, and it had a strange, intricate lock she had never seen before. It was a mortise lock, set flush into the wood, with a keyhole shaped like a cross. Her heart began to beat a little faster. With trembling fingers, she took the brass key from her purse. The key with the bird. She stared at it, then at the lock. It was a long shot, a ridiculous, foolish hope. She slid the key into the lock. It fit. It slid in smoothly, without a hint of resistance, as if it had been waiting. She took a deep breath and turned it. There was a soft, well-oiled click. Not the groan of rust, but the satisfying thunk of a finely tuned mechanism. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open. The ground floor was cavernous and dark, smelling of dust and decay and the ghosts of forgotten commerce. Faint light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, illuminating a vast, empty space. She could see the outlines of where counters once stood, the ghostly squares on the floor where display cases had been. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light like tiny spirits. It was exactly what she had expected. A worthless, empty shell. A wave of disappointment washed over her. The key had worked, but it had led her into a tomb. She stepped inside, her sensible shoes crunching on the debris-strewn floor. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw it. Against the far back wall, tucked away beneath the main staircase that led to the second floor, was another door. A small, unassuming door, painted the same color as the wall, almost perfectly camouflaged. It had no handle, no visible hinges, only a single, tiny, almost invisible keyhole. This was a different kind of lock. It was smaller, more delicate. She approached it, her pulse quickening again. Surely not, it seemed impossible. She held the brass key up again. She looked closer at the key. The shaft was not solid. With a twist, she realized the ornate bird-shaped head was a handle. The main shaft of the key was hollow, and inside it, nested perfectly, was a second, much smaller, simpler key. A key within a key. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely extract it. It was a tiny, skeletal key, no bigger than her pinky finger. She took it to the hidden door and inserted it into the tiny lock. Another perfect fit. She turned it. There was a quiet click, and a section of the wall popped open, revealing itself to be a door. It opened not into a closet, but onto a narrow, enclosed staircase leading up. And from the opening, a different kind of air flowed out. It was not the musty, dead air of the shop. It was cool, dry, and clean. It smelled faintly of cedar and beeswax. It was the air of a place that had been preserved. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped through the doorway and began to climb. The staircase was steep but solid. At the top was another door. She pushed it open and stepped into another world. She was standing in a living room, but it was unlike any living room she had ever seen. It was a perfect, pristine time capsule from the 1950s. A sleek, low-slung sofa with atomic-age legs was upholstered in a cheerful teal fabric. A starburst clock hung on a paneled wall. A hi-fi console, its wood gleaming, stood against the far wall. Everything was immaculate. There was no dust, no sign of decay. It was as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment, 50 years ago, and never returned. Sunlight, warm and golden, streamed through large, clean windows that looked out over the rooftops of the town, not onto the main street. The apartment occupied the entire second floor, but it was completely hidden, its windows facing away from any public view. It was a secret world, floating above the forgotten town. She walked, stunned, through the space. There was a small, efficient kitchen, stocked with gleaming chrome appliances and pastel-colored dishes. A cozy bedroom with a chenille bedspread. A bathroom with perfect pink tile. In the living room, on a handsome wooden desk, sat a leather-bound journal, and on top of the journal, an envelope, addressed in a familiar, confident script. Her name, Eleanor. She sank into the desk chair, her legs suddenly weak. She recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Richard's, but it was the handwriting of a younger man, bolder and more fluid than the cramped script of his later years. With a trembling hand, she opened the envelope. The letter was dated 30 years ago. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, then the world has fallen apart. If you are here, it means I have failed you in some profound way, and we have lost everything." Eleanor read on, the words blurring through her tears. The letter was from a different Richard, a younger, more vulnerable man. He wrote of a time in their marriage she barely remembered, a business crisis in the early 80s when he had been on the verge of bankruptcy. He had been terrified, ashamed, too proud to tell her how close they were to the edge. During that time of intense fear, he had created this place, this sanctuary. He had bought the old building in Harmony Creek, a town where he had spent a happy summer as a boy, and secretly, painstakingly, he had built this apartment. It was his escape plan, a lifeboat for the two of them in case his grand ambitions sank. "I furnished it with things from the era we met," he wrote. "I thought it might make you smile. I imagined us growing old here, away from all the pressure and the noise, a simpler life." He explained that he had set up a blind trust, funded with a significant sum of money from a successful early deal. Sections. The trust's sole purpose was to pay the property taxes and basic utilities for the building in perpetuity. Sections. It was managed by a small local law firm in a nearby town, with instructions that were to remain sealed unless the property was sold, an eventuality the trust was designed to prevent. Sections. The business crisis had passed. Sections. Richard's company had soared. The fear had receded, and with it, the memory of this place. He had become the powerful man he always wanted to be, and the vulnerability that led him to create this sanctuary was buried deep. "I should have told you," the letter concluded. "I should have shown you this place, but it was a monument to my fear, and I wanted to forget I was ever that man. I locked the door and tried to forget the key. I see now that was a mistake. Pride is a cold companion. I hope, if you are here, that this place can offer you some small peace. It was built with love, Eleanor, my truest love for you. Please forgive me." She folded the letter, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. Sorrow for the man he had been. anger at the man he had become, and a profound, overwhelming sense of a connection that had been lost not just to her, but to him as well. He had forgotten his own heart. He had left his best self locked away in this room. But the letter was not the only thing on the desk. The leather journal was filled with his younger handwriting, detailing the construction of the apartment. And in the final entry, he mentioned one last secret. "For our nest egg," he had written, "behind the painting of the sea, the combination is your birthday." Eleanor looked up. On the wall opposite the desk hung a large, dramatic oil painting of a stormy ocean. It was the only thing in the apartment that felt out of place, too dark and turbulent for the otherwise cheerful room. She walked over to it and with some effort lifted it from its hook. Behind it, flush with the wall, was the gray metal door of a safe. Her hands shaking, she dialed the combination. Her birthday. The safe clicked open. Inside, there were several stacks of $100 bills, bound with paper bands. A velvet pouch containing a simple, elegant pearl necklace and matching earrings, and a thick, leather-bound folio. She opened the folio. It was not filled with love letters or memories. It was filled with financial documents, old ledgers, correspondence, contracts. They detailed the very beginnings of Richard's company, and they were damning. Eleanor was no businesswoman, but she had lived in that world long enough to understand what she was seeing. Shady land deals, consulting fees paid to city officials, a creative accounting scheme that had hidden assets from an early partner he had bought out for pennies on the dollar. It was the blueprint of a fortune built on a foundation of ethical rot. The paranoid young man who had built a secret apartment had also saved the evidence of his own transgressions, a hedge against future betrayals perhaps. And as she flipped through the pages, she saw a familiar name, Stephen Sterling. There were memos from a young Stephen, just starting at the company, suggesting ways to expand upon his father's ethically dubious methods. He had not just inherited his father's company, he had inherited his sins and perfected them. Eleanor closed the folio slowly. This was not a nest egg. This was a weapon. This was leverage. This was power. The young, frightened Richard, in an act of love and fear, had inadvertently handed her the means to her own salvation and the instrument of his children's downfall. The transformation of Eleanor Sterling began not with a grand gesture, but with a simple act. She opened a window. She let the fresh, clean air of Harmony Creek circulate through the apartment, chasing away the last lingering staleness of its sealed-off past. Then, she began to make the place her own. The apartment was a museum of a life she and Richard never had, and while she was grateful for its existence, she could not live inside a memory. She packed away some of the more intensely nostalgic items, the framed photos of a young, smiling Richard, the monogrammed cocktail shaker. She kept the beautiful, solid furniture, the starburst clock, the cheerful teal sofa. She retrieved her own things from the post office, her books, a few cherished paintings done by her mother, the worn quilt from her favorite armchair. Slowly, carefully, she began to weave her own story into the fabric of the apartment. The space began to breathe with her. Her first foray into the town was tentative. She needed groceries. She walked down the main street feeling self-conscious, an outsider. She entered the small cafe with the red awning, the Daily Grind. Behind the counter was a woman about 20 years her junior, with a cascade of graying red hair and a smile that seemed to light up the room. "Well, hello there," the woman said. "Haven't seen you around here before. I'm Martha." Eleanor, accustomed to being invisible, was taken aback by the direct, open friendliness. "I'm Eleanor," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I'm new." "New is good. This town could use some new," Martha laughed. "What can I get for you?" That first conversation was the beginning of a friendship, the first true friendship Eleanor had made in decades. Her life with Richard had been filled with acquaintances, the wives of business partners, the members of the country club. But a friend, a real friend, was something she had not had in a very long time. Martha was a font of local knowledge and boundless energy. When Eleanor mentioned she was staying in the old Emporium building, Martha's eyes widened. The old Miller place? Honey, that place has been empty since before I moved here 30 years ago. They say a ghost pays the taxes. Eleanor smiled. I suppose the ghost has a new roommate. Martha helped her navigate the practicalities of her new life. She introduced her to the grocer, who started setting aside the freshest produce for her. She pointed her to the hardware store owner, a gruff but kind man named George, who helped her figure out the building's ancient plumbing. Through Martha, Eleanor began to meet the town. She learned that Harmony Creek was a community of people who had, in one way or another, chosen a quieter life. They were resilient, kind, and deeply curious about the elegant, quiet woman who had mysteriously appeared in their midst. As the weeks turned into months, Eleanor felt a change within herself. The fear that had haunted her in the city began to recede. The security of the apartment, the knowledge of the funds in the safe, and the power of the documents in the folio created a foundation of safety she had never truly possessed, not even in her grand house. Her posture straightened. The anxious, haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a calm, steady gaze. She had spent her life in service to a man's ambition. Now, for the first time, she began to think about her own. She started spending time in the cavernous, dusty ground floor of the Emporium. She hired a local crew to help her pry the plywood from the windows. Light flooded the space for the first time in a generation. She and Martha spent a week just cleaning, scrubbing away decades of grime. As they worked, an idea began to form in Eleanor's mind. This vast, beautiful space, right in the heart of the town, it was wasted. Harmony Creek had no library, no community center, no place for people to simply gather, especially the older residents who were often isolated during the long winters. She had the space. She had the resources. She had a purpose. The news of her quiet inheritance must have eventually trickled through the legal channels back to the city. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Eleanor was supervising the installation of new, energy-efficient windows in the storefront, a sleek black sedan with city plates rolled silently down Main Street and parked in front of the Emporium. Stephen and Claire Sterling got out. They looked completely out of place, their expensive city clothes a jarring contrast to the town's gentle, weathered aesthetic. Their faces wore expressions of smug disbelief. They had come to the wilderness to find the crazy old woman their father had discarded. They expected to find her in squalor, a pathetic creature they could easily manipulate, perhaps buying the worthless property from her for a pittance to finally clear their father's books. They saw the new windows. They saw the fresh paint on the doorframe. They saw the flower boxes filled with autumn mums that now lined the entrance. And then they saw Eleanor. She walked out to meet them, wiping her hands on a simple apron. She was not the broken, weeping woman they had expelled from her home. Her silver hair was elegantly styled. She wore simple, well-fitting trousers and a cashmere sweater. She looked healthy, calm, and radiating a quiet authority they had never seen before. She looked powerful. "Stephen, Claire," she said, her voice even and cool. "What a surprise. I can't imagine what would bring you all this way." The power shift was immediate and absolute. They were on her territory now. The carefully constructed world of corporate boardrooms and legal maneuvering had no purchase here. Here, they were merely visitors, and she was the one in charge. Stephen recovered first, his default arrogance kicking in. "Eleanor, you've been busy," he said, gesturing at the building with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We were in the area. We heard you'd settled here. We were concerned." The lie was so transparent it was insulting. "Concerned," Eleanor repeated, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. "How thoughtful of you." Claire, ever the pragmatist, got straight to the point. "The place looks better than we expected," she conceded, her eyes scanning the building with a practiced, predatory assessment. "Father was wondering about this property. There are some old tax records we can't seem to reconcile. We thought perhaps you'd be interested in selling, tidying things up. They saw her as a problem to be tidied. They saw the building as an asset to be acquired. They still didn't see her at all. "Why don't you come in?" Eleanor said, her voice smooth as silk. "We have much to discuss." She did not lead them into the dusty, under-construction storefront. She led them through the hidden side door, up the secret staircase, and into her apartment. The shock on their faces was a pleasure she savored, a small, private vindication. They stepped into the sun-drenched, beautifully appointed living room, their mouths slightly agape. They took in the gleaming wood, the stylish furniture, the art on the walls. This was not squalor. This was not poverty. This was elegance. This was wealth, but a different kind of wealth than they understood. It was quiet, confident, and utterly inaccessible to them. "Please sit down," Eleanor said, gesturing to the teal sofa. They sat, stiff and uncomfortable, their expensive suits suddenly looking foolish and out of place. Eleanor remained standing, a queen in her own court. "You came to talk about the property," she began. "You're right. There are some old records associated with this place that are quite interesting." She walked to the desk, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not take out the entire folio. That would be too dramatic, too crude. She had made a single, high-quality copy of one specific document, a memo from a young Stephen Sterling to his father, outlining a plan to systematically undervalue a parcel of land before a city auction, using a shell corporation and a friendly city planning official. It was blatant, undeniable fraud. She placed the single sheet of paper on the polished coffee table in front of them. "I believe this is your handwriting, Stephen," she said quietly. Stephen picked up the paper. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant condescension, went slack. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, sickly gray. He looked from the paper to Eleanor, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure animal fear. Claire leaned over, read the document, and her own composure finally shattered. "Where did you get this?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "Your father was a very careful man," Eleanor replied calmly. "In his youth, at least, he kept meticulous records of everything." The implication hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. This was not the only document. This was just a sample. "What do you want?" Stephen finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw panic of a cornered animal. "Money?" Section Eleanor almost laughed. They still thought in those terms. Money. As if that was the only thing anyone could ever want. "I have everything I need, Stephen," she said, her gaze sweeping around her beautiful, secret home. "What I want is peace. What I want is to be left alone. What I want is for the world you and your father built to have no further intersection with mine." She then laid out her terms. They were simple, elegant, and non-negotiable. Section. She had prepared a legal document with the help of the old, trusted law firm that managed the trust. The document stipulated that Stephen and Claire would immediately and irrevocably sign over their rights to any future inheritance from Richard's estate. Not to her, but to a charitable foundation she was establishing. A foundation dedicated to providing legal aid to elderly people facing unjust divorces and evictions. The Harmony Project. "You will sign this," Eleanor said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You will leave Harmony Creek, and you will never contact me again. You will not sell this property. You will not investigate its taxes. You will forget it exists. In return, the rest of your father's youthful records will remain in their secure, undisclosed location, unread by any authorities." It was a checkmate. To refuse was to face total ruin. The document she had shown them was 30 years old, but the pattern of behavior it established was current. An investigation into the company's past would inevitably uncover its present. It would mean lawsuits, criminal charges, the collapse of the Sterling Empire. Their greed, their ambition, their casual cruelty had led them directly to this room, to this moment of utter defeat at the hands of the invisible woman they had so thoroughly underestimated. Stephen stared at her, his face a mask of impotent rage. "You can't do this," he whispered. "I can," Eleanor said, her voice soft but with a core of steel. "And I have. You underestimated me, you and your father. You saw a quiet woman who arranged flowers and planned dinner parties. You never bothered to look any deeper. You never imagined I might be intelligent. You never imagined I might be strong. That was your mistake, not mine." Claire, always the pragmatist, knew when the game was lost. She picked up the pen. "Where do we sign?" she asked, her voice flat and dead. The aftermath was quiet. There was no grand explosion, no public downfall. Stephen and Claire signed the documents, their hands shaking with fury and defeat. They left Harmony Creek in their sleek black car, their faces pale and drawn. They faded from Eleanor's life as completely as if they had never existed. Their defeat was not a headline, but a slow, internal collapse. Stripped of their future inheritance, their vast appetites for luxury and expansion became unsustainable. Cracks began to show in the Sterling Empire, small at first, then widening into fissures. Without Eleanor's intervention, their own greed and risky dealings eventually caught up with them. Their house of cards, built on a rotten foundation, began to tremble. Eleanor never heard from Richard again directly. She heard through Martha, who heard from a cousin who lived in the city, that his new life had soured. The young, vibrant Candace had not signed on for a life of diminished resources and legal troubles. Richard was left an old man in a cold, modern house, haunted by the ghosts of his own choices. Eleanor felt a pang of pity for him, but it was distant, like a memory of a character in a book she had read long ago. His fate was his own making. Her focus was on the future, her new beginning. With the legal matters settled and her peace secured, she threw herself into her project. The ground floor of the Harmony Creek Emporium was transformed. With the help of the community, the vast, empty space came alive. One side became a lending library, its shelves built by George from the hardware store, and stocked with books donated by people from 3 towns over. The other side became a warm, inviting cafe and sitting area, run by volunteers and serving free coffee and tea. It was a place for people to gather, to talk, to escape the loneliness of their own homes. Sections. The back of the store, once used for storage, was converted into a workshop space for local artisans, a weaver, a potter, a woodworker, who could use the space for free in exchange for teaching occasional classes to the community. Sections. She called it the Emporium Project, a nod to its past and a promise for its future. Eleanor was its heart. She was there every day, not as a wealthy benefactress, but as a worker. She shelved books. She poured coffee. She sat and listened to the stories of her neighbors. She, who had been made to feel invisible, now made it her mission to see everyone. She knew who was sick, who was lonely, who was struggling. Her foundation, the Harmony Project, quietly funded by the income from the investments Richard had unwittingly signed over, began its work, offering grants and legal aid to women who found themselves in the same position she had been in. Sections. 1 year after the confrontation with Stephen and Claire, Eleanor stood at the large front window of the Emporium, looking out at the main street of her town. It was a snowy evening, the streetlights casting a warm glow on the falling flakes. Inside, the space was filled with light and laughter. A group of seniors was playing cards at one table. A young mother was reading a picture book to her child in the library corner. The scent of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. Martha came and stood beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Look at what you built, Eleanor," she said softly. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. She had not built it alone. She had simply opened a door. She had been given a worthless building, and she had found a home. She had been handed a key to nowhere, and it had unlocked everything. Her life had not ended at 72. It had begun. She was not the forgotten wife of a rich man. She was Eleanor, and she was finally, completely, home. The final theme of her life was not one of bitterness or revenge. It was one of quiet, resilient purpose. She had discovered that true worth was not something that could be given or taken away by another person. It was not measured in square footage or bank balances. It was found in dignity. It was forged in resilience. It was realized in the act of building something new from the wreckage of the old. The greatest secret the brass key had unlocked was not the hidden apartment or the incriminating documents. It was the woman who had been locked inside Eleanor herself for all those years. A woman who was strong, capable, and full of a quiet, powerful light. And in the heart of a small, forgotten town, she finally let that light shine.